Hi, everyone. Welcome to the audio and video interviews of the Cleft Palate Craniofacial Journal. I'm Pat Chibbaro, as you can see, Michigan fan, go blue. And I am the multimedia editor of the journal. And I'm really excited for this interview to talk about a paper that I think is really important for everybody on the teams. I think, we're all very interested in making sure that our patients and their families understand their child or their condition, and how to get prepared for surgeries and care afterwards, and just the importance of understanding, because it has an impact on their overall health and their outcomes. And so let's talk about this very important paper, which you can see I've read fully and highlighted. It is you'll find this online first. It came out November 3rd, and so hot off the press, and it is availability and readability level of online patient education materials provided by Cleft Lip and Palate teams. The authors are Dr. Lauren Powell, Erica Bean, Jade Cohen, and Ruth Barta, and they are from the great state of Minnesota. The Division of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, University of Minnesota, the School of Medicine, and the Department of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery Health Partners in St. Paul. So I'm very happy to have Lauren Powell and Ruth Barta here with me. Thanks so much for getting up early and joining me for this talk. Thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so as I usually like to start, I always wonder what makes you want to do all this work, because it's a lot of work. We know that. What motivated you, Lauren, to take on this study?
Yeah, so I've done a couple of health literacy studies now over the last couple of years, and really started them in medical school. And when I was a medical student and I was getting ready to apply to plastic surgery, I knew that research was a big component to my application. But I wanted to start researching in an area that I was interested in and passionate about. And for me, it kind of stems even further back. My dad is in medicine and works with uninsured patients. And so I saw a lot of disparities growing up within medicine, and also just from an understanding perspective of medical terms that can be very difficult for patients that don't have a medical background. And so for me, I started reading about health literacy, started seeing some of the studies that were currently out there. At the time, there was only a handful within the plastic surgery literature. So I started to kind of delve into that area. And really at the beginning of my research journey, I was looking mostly at materials written in English, and usually materials kind of targeted towards adult patients. And so as I went into residency, I really wanted to expand the research and start to make changes and really impact the field. I think there's one part of just describing and saying we have a problem, we need to write our patient education materials at a level that's understandable for patients. But then kind of the next step is, how do we push this further? How do we impact more patients who speak different languages? And then how do we actually implement that in our day-to-day life with patients? And so for this study in particular, this was my first one where I was looking both at materials written in English and materials written in Spanish. And then from there, I think what's really interesting, particularly within the pediatric plastic surgery patient population, is you have your caregivers and your family members who are really involved, especially when their patients are at a young age. But really, as time goes on, those patients can start to take a little bit of more ownership in their healthcare and become more involved. So I thought it was a really interesting dichotomy within this literature and what we could add to it with this study.
So maybe give us a little bit of an overview before we talk about some of your challenges and future studies. I would love for I really do think that this is important, because one of the things that you mentioned in the paper is you have people from all different specialties writing patient education information, which I think even makes it more challenging to make it at a readability level. And I have so many thoughts about this. Even just now, I was thinking of a few questions that I didn't even think that I was going to talk to you about. So give us just a brief overview, and then we can get into some more details.
So we were looking at the websites of ACPA approved teams, and specifically we were looking for their materials provided again in English and provided in Spanish. We were looking specifically at the kind of the general main page that patients would encounter, and we would run these through different readability calculators. And so these calculators are great, actually, kind of from my own background and understanding, I found out that these calculators were really developed to be used in schools because you're like, well, how do I write something for a third grader versus a fourth grader versus a fifth grader? So
Right.
a lot of these are used within the education literature. So there are specific tools that have been validated though for healthcare materials. So we utilized those and utilized those for materials written in English, and then became the challenge of can we use the same tools for Spanish? And the answer is no, because there are some differences, and a lot of our calculators that we use are based on the number of syllables in a word, and a lot of words that may be considered more simple in Spanish have more syllables. So there's this issue there with trying to pick the right calculators. So we had to delve a little bit more into the literature to see what would be validated for materials written in Spanish. So we also ran those through validated calculators. And then our findings were that the materials written in English kind of across the board were written at what we would say is a higher reading grade level. So about a 10th to 11th grade reading grade level. And the recommendation is that materials are written at a 6th to 7th grade reading level, because that's really what the average US adult reads healthcare materials. And for Spanish, interestingly, we're a little bit lower. So it's closer to a 10th grade reading grade level. However, only about 23% of the teams had materials even offered in Spanish online, which is really interesting for us.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I guess one of the things that I was thinking was for that 23%, when you look at all the teams, obviously around the country, different teams have different patient populations. So I was wondering be so interesting to know. And I think you talked a little bit about this. I think in California, there's a high Spanish speaking population. And even there, you would maybe expect that they'd have a higher percentage of education materials in Spanish, but then they did. And I'm thinking about myself in New York, and we have a very, very large Spanish population. We also have a very large Asian population, and that's a whole other, and you mentioned that in your paper is, other languages. I mean, for us in New York, it's like, the UN. I mean, we have every, and that's why just to get through a consultation, we have to have, in-person or video interpreters. And I'm just thinking, for patient education materials, how do we accomplish having, meeting the needs of all of these patients, and, just, to the thing about the calculators. I mean, as a nurse practitioner on the team, I wrote a ton of patient education materials. Never once did I put them through a calculator to see, what the readability level was. What I used to do was I would have some parents that I would show them to and ask them for their comments, but when you think about that, it's like, well, what parents are you showing this to, and what's their reading level? It's very complicated. It's really way more complicated than you would think on the surface of it. So, I'm really glad that you looked into that. And so, one of the questions I had about this was there anything that you found, like, were you at all surprised with any of the findings, or not at all, or?
Yeah, I think it was surprising to see how few of the centers had materials written in Spanish online. And that's just, in Spanish, we weren't even going through and exploring other languages like you had mentioned. And so I think I was a bit surprised by that. And then I was also surprised that the Spanish materials were written at a lower reading grade level than those that were written in English. So I thought that was very interesting, because
that is
a lot of these studies now, and almost uniformly, the reading grade level is at the high school level or college reading grade level. And so it was really interesting, because that was some of the closest we've actually had to the recommended reading grade level, still a couple of grades higher, but I thought that was a very interesting discovery from these materials.
Lauren, I was thinking about that because, again, as someone who was responsible for writing a lot of it, there were the challenges that, and I'm sure, whoever's listening to this, whenever we'd be asked to write patient education materials, and they would say, well, you should have it in Spanish, maybe in Chinese, and I would go, it's because, how do you do that? Now back in the day, before you had Google Translate, I would try to find someone, who would, could translate it into Spanish for me or into Chinese. One of the interpreters volunteer, otherwise you have to pay for it, So I was thinking about some of the reasons why the numbers are less. The other thing I was thinking about is that I'm all about not recreating or reinventing the wheel. And so I would refer patients to the ACPA site or for those materials, or I would print them out, or I just have copies of them in English and Spanish. And I was wondering, I know that you looked at the team sites, but I wonder, have we checked the readability level of all the ACPA handouts? The patient education materials. That was one thing that I was wondering.
That's a great question.
I helped write some of them.
Yeah. Because we were mostly focused on the particular centers, but I think that's a really interesting question, is to run the ACPA materials through and see where.
And it's just so interesting to me. But I was, and the other point that you brought up, which I thought was really important for people to know, is if you're relying on Google Translate, it doesn't always correctly translate, and I thought that was also an important thing for people to know who are writing these things. And I'm really, this is really near and dear to me because I know just from being involved with the ACPA for so long is that my nursing and coordinator colleagues are often the ones that are writing this information. And I can tell you that, if I'd asked 10 of my colleagues in this area, none of them would have said, well, yes, I write, and then I put it through, these calculations. I don't think it was just something on our, because we're not my daughter's a teacher. And so I actually want to ask her, is this something that she did? Because she writes a lot of things for the other teachers and for students in, I think, middle school level. So it's just so interesting, to try to figure out what people are, what tools that are available that we don't even know about, So I'm really glad that, because it would make me, and I was, in the next forum that I have with the nurses and coordinators, as we meet online, is to say, you should read this paper because you might want to, really take a look at, so your work's really important, Lauren. And so I'm glad that, that you did this, and I know it's a lot of work. So, was there anything that, as you read back on your paper, that didn't go into the paper, or do you feel that pretty much everything went in? Because often there's something that you'd say, oh, I wish I had put that in.
I think that the big things that I think about is, again, as I'm kind of delving into the health literacy world and expanding the research, I think about what are my limitations? What else are we not analyzing? Because I know that for health literacy, we're solely focused on the written aspect of the materials, but we know that the photographs, videos, and then on top of that, even just the conversations, of course, that the providers are having with their patients are really, really crucial to a patient's understanding. So I think to be able to fully capture a patient's true understanding of the materials that are being presented to them it's really hard to capture within a paper that's solely focused on written materials. And I am still trying to explore the way to capture all of this in a paper, but it's really being broken up into certain areas as I explore the health literacy world.
Well, just think, you're what year are you in your residency?
I'm in my third year.
So you have your whole professional career that you can become the expert on this. I would like to see you, and a few, I don't know what you submitted for next year's ACPA meeting, but think about in the future, you could do like a whole study session on writing patient education materials. I can tell you, you'll fill the room. And, one of the things that, we were talking about this before. I'll hold up this sheet. This is, I love this. This is a table of examples of English and Spanish language word substitutions to improve readability. And I was thinking it would just be great if you could create, doesn't have to be you, but create a whole, handbook, a whole document that people could go to that have a breakdown of some of there's a lot of not easy to understand words in our cleft and craniofacial world, as you both know. And just to be able to have a reference, I think that would be that's something that's, I'm always thinking about what other people could do when I read their papers.
Well, to your point too, Pat, about not reinventing the wheel, I think we're moving forward to a lot more collaboration. ACPA does that. So
yes,
there are so many areas across the US that have higher populations of, whether it's Spanish. Here in Minnesota, we have a huge Hmong and Somali population. So, tapping each area to sort of be the leaders in that particular language might be helpful. And then collaborating at ACPA and having those handouts would be just something I'd love to see.
That's a great idea. I mean, right now we are you were talking about other modes of communication. Is in 2006, we did the feeding video, which is the video that's still posted to this day. And I was involved with that and writing it and being in it. And now we are redoing the video. Finally, we're redoing it's a big project. And so you talk about collaboration, our committee are ACPA members from around the country. And I think that, back to your point, to collaborate and for us, we have a very large Asian population. We should have, a lot of things that are in, Chinese, and then there's Cantonese and Mandarin, it's a lot of work. And I think that's an awesome idea to really break it down. There you go. There's bring that up to the ACPA. But Lauren, you should do definitely a workshop on this where, people would love it. Like give them something that is at the 12th grade level and let's write it at the 6th grade level. That's, and it's not as easy to do as you would think, right? And so I love that. And you wanted to just, before we end, is to talk about the limitations. And it always makes me sad when an author says this study had several limitations. It makes me feel like you feel bad about like you didn't do enough. Well, first of all, you did, but talk about your limitations. And I think you mentioned it a little bit already.
Yeah, I think, I guess I can start with just talking about readability calculators in general, because we know that the readability calculators, they have different formulas that they'll calculate a reading grade level. So it's typically going to be based on like the number of words in a sentence, how long a word is, how many syllables there are in a word. And so these formulas will give you a score based on that. But we can see some variation within the tools. They generally tend to be fairly similar, but I think that can always be a limitation going through. And so obviously the more tools that you use to give you an average usually is the best way to do these studies. Another part of it is that the readability calculators require a minimum number of words. So they require at least 100 words, but they also have a maximum. So I think it's somewhere around 3,000 to 5,000 words. And so for longer sections of text, it may cut off some of the text if it's a really, really lengthy piece. Or if some of the websites are really just targeted, have some bullet points, but don't meet the 100 word criteria, that can sort of limit what we're looking at in the study from just a logistics standpoint. And then, of course, like we said, the readability or understanding plays in with the photographs and videos, with the conversations that patients have with providers. So to be able to fully capture a patient's true understanding is really tough just from a written perspective. So I think those are really the big things that I think about for this study.
The other thing I was thinking about in terms of other modes of information is that there are a lot of parents talking to each other and trying and educating each other. And I was reading something on one of the parent sites that one parent was giving advice to another, and often it's advice based on their own personal experience. And I was reading and I was thinking, ooh, I don't know that that's really true. And then the mom is thanking that mom for giving that information. And, so they're getting, and it's just like information, almost information overload. And it's a lot, One thing I was thinking just as we're having this conversation is, you were talking about at what point do you make it patient information for the patients themselves? And I was thinking that one of the points, depending on their age, is when you're doing the alveolar bone grafts. And I was thinking that's a really tough surgery to explain when you have to explain that to kids, and I'm wondering, and I never wrote anything. I had a whole packet of information that I wrote for the parents, but not for the kids. And, sometimes kids are older and you wonder, like, what do you think about that? Like, at what age do you think you should have something that's specifically for the kids?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't know if you want to speak from your experience.
Yeah, what do you think?
So in my practice, from the time kids are about 3 to 5 years of age, I tell families during the visit, your parents make the decision, but you're old enough to be part of your medical care. And so I just try to find day-to-day examples that they would understand. My classic example to them about what is bone graft surgery, I sort of compare it to gardening, right? If you have a plant in a pot with no soil and they're all like, they're big-eyed and they're like, it's gonna die. And so I sort of compare that to teeth and needing, good bone to go into that. But I agree with you, finding, at what point do we make that transition? Another area that is a big hot topic right now is that transition of care from childhood to adulthood, which is, I know, not the topic today, but certainly something really fascinating to look into. Going back a little bit to about the written materials, in-person conversations, even potentially maybe making videos on the ACPA website at each targeted level. So exactly to your point, at bone grafting, maybe we, even though the education, yes, is to the parents, just target it towards the 7 to 10-year-old kids, because if they understand it, then certainly the parents should as well.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. I think we have focused so much on the parents and, of course, we want them to have the most information possible, but I do think it would be, really interesting. I would love to be able to have videos for, different ages. And then, we as, the team members would be able to have parents go to that site or have the kids go to that site and, and something that, obviously every team does things a little bit differently, so you would do it in as generic a way as possible. But yeah, no, just so many thoughts came from your paper. So yay to you. So Laura, is there anything specifically for the future you're working on or already working on? Because often when I talk to authors, they're already midway through the next thing. So what's the next thing?
Yeah, so our next step in this is actually surveying patients and their families and asking how would you even like these materials to be presented to you? Because I think there's different formats for written materials, and as people are having more and more access to smartphones and being able to use apps, again, websites, just even having the written materials in clinic. Versus these videos or podcasts, or like you even mentioned the support groups online. A lot of patients are using those and really interested in using those. So I think that's really our next step is how do you want us to present these materials, or what options do you want to have to look at these and what would you use? And again, surveying patients who speak different languages and getting their perspectives, surveying patients who were cared for when they were a kid, but now they're over 18 and they have an opinion about their care too. So I think it's been an interesting study that we've been developing right now.
Right. Well, and my last question for you is, there are a lot of people that are in your position, so they're residents and they're thinking about the research they need or want to do. Any advice for them?
I guess it's a tough question because I think there's a lot of components to it, but I think the biggest thing that I've learned, especially for this paper reflected on recently, is having a good team to collaborate with and with different resources and skills. So really, we've been using some medical students who have a really strong statistical background, or we have statisticians here within the University of Minnesota that we can use to help with our studies and strengthen them and make them stronger, using people who have a background in speaking Spanish or different languages and are native speakers and really can use them as a resource for these projects. I think having that collaboration is really, really valuable for these projects, and I encourage new researchers as they move along to really use their resources and the people that they're working with.
Great, great. Any last thoughts before I? No, I learned so much from this paper, and a lot of things to think about. And I think again, that collaboration, and we're really so lucky that we have, this wonderful network around, through the ACPA, and just makes, just so helpful to be able to share this information with each other. And so let me, for those who are listening or watching, this is a really wonderful paper that you can see online first, just came out November 3rd, and it's availability and readability level of online patient education materials provided by Cleft, Lip, and Palate teams by Drs. Lauren Powell, Erica Bean, Jade Cohen, and Ruth Barta. And thanks, Lauren and Ruth, for being with me, getting up early, and or maybe you guys have to go to the OR. Or
10 hours, we're used to it. It's what we love.
I know, I was thinking that this morning, like, oh, they're used to getting up early. That's okay.
Today's actually our Cleft and Craniofacial joint clinic day. So we have about 90 patients coming through our multidisciplinary clinic today. So that's why we're up early on our third cup of coffee already.
There you go. Yay, yay. Well, thanks so much. And I hope to see you at the meeting next year. I hope to see you there. And looking forward to it, and look forward to certainly seeing your names on more papers moving forward. So thanks again for joining me, and thanks so much for your work. It's really important.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.